As I said earlier, Grew was very involved in the anti-slavery movement and the abolitionist movement. And there was another gentleman at the same time who was also very active in that movement. His name was George Storrs. When we researched this portion of the Faith in Action film that discusses George Storrs, we found a very interesting dilemma that we hadn't seen before when looking at the microfilm of the original documents that Watchtower quotes. You can see from the Anti-Slavery Almanac in 1839, there's a story about George Storrs here being arrested while he was preaching in the church against slavery. That's how opposed folks were at that time to this issue. And here's a letter from William Lloyd Garrison to his wife mentioning Storrs' story about that arrest. So it was a very well-known story. Again, both Grew and Storrs very active in that movement. Well,
and it's odd that took place in New Hampshire, of all places, because the North was more liberal and anti-slavery mindset. You would expect something more in the cotton states, the farming belt where they used slaves for that to be, and yet it's in a northern area surrounded by other states that were anti-slavery.
And a lot of those, many of those denominations were quite opposed to slavery as well. So George Storrs being involved in the Methodist movement as a Methodist pastor, it was not really accepted there either. So they could have lost their life, their source of income, their pastorship, because they were preaching things that the church did not at the time believe.
And according to this, he was dragged from his knees while praying.
Yeah. So I like the little artwork there that they have of that. It really keeps it emblazoned on the mind. But these two guys were together, Storrs and Grew, because they were fighting for the cause of freedom. They were involved in various protests and demonstrations against slavery. I think the real reason that Watchtower doesn't mention it is because of their current stance on neutrality. That was not a position that Russell, Storrs, or Grew had held. And so that's why they were involved in those particular activities. Watchtower doesn't mention it because it doesn't fit their narrative. They had an article recently on jw.org that was specifically against protests and things like this. And the reason this was posted was because they watch the current affairs, they watch the news, and whatever is newsworthy, they try and find something, an article or something to post to draw people in, to try and gather their interest in the particular subjects. But what Henry Grew and George Storrs was doing was so commendable. I mean, absolutely incredible what these men and others were doing, including Grew's daughter, Mary. Why doesn't Watchtower mention this? This is a very important part of their history. This is how the two men were connected. So in the film, the Faith in Action film, it mentions that George Storrs just happened to find this pamphlet on the train.
Grew's pamphlet would have far-reaching effects. His work caught the attention of Methodist minister George Storrs. Intrigued, Storrs spent the next 3 years studying the matter.
The scriptures are clear on this point.
Yet his findings met with little interest by his fellow ministers.
In Ezekiel 18:4, the soul that sinneth, it shall die.
And finally, by 1840, his conscience troubled him so much over the difference between what the Bible was teaching and what he was being obliged to teach as a Methodist Episcopal minister that he resigned his position.
In 1842, Storrs began publishing a monthly magazine entitled Bible Examiner. Before long, he met Henry Grew in person. The two became close friends and collaborated in debates against proponents of the immortal soul doctrine.
Yes, and that scripture, Ezekiel 18:4, that one I thought was so...
George Storrs believed that in order for everyone living during the time of Christ's return to have an opportunity for salvation, a global preaching campaign was needed. He had no idea how such a thing could be accomplished, but in faith he wrote,
Yet too many, if they cannot see just how a thing is to be done, reject it, as if it were impossible for God.
Storrs died in 1879 at his home in Brooklyn, New York, in the very neighborhood that would become the focal point of the worldwide preaching work he had so eagerly anticipated. The stage was now set for light to emerge from darkness.
Well, how did he find the pamphlet on the train? The two men were on that same train together, right? They were going to the same anti-slavery meetings. And of course, Grew is going to leave his pamphlets around to see if anyone's interested. And so that's how George Storrs found the pamphlet. And he studied it for 3 years before he himself started to spread the same ideas as well. George Storrs is really the one that was the most influential in bringing this idea of conditional immortality, this idea about no immortal soul, no hell, into the Millerite movement. In his pamphlet he wrote on 6 sermons, that was more famous than Grew's writings itself. And Watchtower shows the two men walking and talking about a simple subject like, and that Ezekiel passage, the soul that sins shall die.
Before long, he met Henry Grew in person. The two became close friends and collaborated in debates against proponents of the immortal soul doctrine.
Yes, in that scripture, Ezekiel 18:4.
That's not the kind of discussions they were having. We have some of those discussions recorded.
Well, the video wants to give the impression, Faith in Action wants to give the impression that their ideas were a mindset and a process solely through their channel and unto them delivered on a platter. That's the impression you get from that. Whereas there was, when you peel the onion away, there was so much going on outside of everything that video is saying that it's just, that's why we're doing this.
George Storrs started a magazine called the Bible Examiner. And, you know, the film shows Grew and Storrs in complete agreement. They were, but just on the basic concept of the doctrine. But the details about who would be impacted by the doctrine were debated by these two men publicly. They were on complete opposite sides of each other in the pages of the Bible Examiner. The arguments were deep, complex, and though provoking, they were much more than the simple statement Watchtower uses in the film to illustrate the point. So these two men would hardly have been discussing the areas of agreement. They were always seeking truth and debating these things, trying to figure this stuff out together. So these ideas would continue to grow as in Storrs' mind for years.
They do show that particular debate coming together and coming to a fruition, but they show it through Russell with his father and other ones as if it culminated with him and he was the one who brought it all forth.
We're going to get to that. There's some very interesting things there that we've discovered. Stay tuned. So in the pages of the Examiner, Storrs and Grew were debating whether or not the wicked would be resurrected. What did the Bible say about that? Storrs took the negative side, and Grew took the positive side. After Grew died, about a decade after Grew died, Storrs started to reevaluate his position on that and realized there's a lot of other scriptures he hadn't considered on the point, and he switched sides. He went to the affirmative. And at that time, he had ceased publishing the Bible Examiner and started to publish a new paper called The Herald of Life in the Coming Kingdom, which was another one of the Advent Christian denomination papers, just like The World's Crisis. Another direct link, of course, to this Christian denomination. That's why we had that discussion with Pastor Dean.
The scriptures are clear on this point.
Yet his
that the
findings
soul
met with little
is
interest by his
not
fellow ministers.
in Ezekiel 18:4. The soul that sinneth, it shall die.
And finally, by 1840, his conscience troubled him so much over the difference between what the Bible was teaching and what he was being obliged to teach as a Methodist Episcopal minister that he resigned his position.
So in an 1879 Bible Examiner, Storrs gives his opinion about organizations, and specifically church organizations. He was completely against it. Storrs is talking about why he left his church in the 1840s. The reason Storrs really left is because he felt organization, and especially church organizations, were wrong. This is actually...
for those who Jehovah's Witnesses who don't know this, Russell was very adamant on that same philosophy and thought process himself.
Yes. Where did he get it from? He got it from the men he directly dealt with. This is where the ideas came from.
And then after his death, it departed from that mindset.
So it's interesting Watchtower mentions this, but they don't mention the actual reasons why. So I find that very strange. Here in the article, Storrs says, I have never organized a church since I left the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1840, believing that all who receive Christ and are accepted of him are by the Spirit baptized into one body, or Church of Christ.
They followed, Jeff, like the early Christians did. There was the Ephesians, there was the Romans, the Thessalonians. Each had their ecclesia, and each one was given, you had the basic doctrines of Christ that they believed in, of course. Was there a committee in Jerusalem? Well, yes. Peter, Paul, they did travel and meet and convene, but it wasn't a thumbs down on what you can do in every aspect of life. They gave guidance on eating things from blood, doing this, doing that. But it wasn't a control of your life. Even one of I can't remember which of the congregations, they on their own decided to sell everything and collectively make their own little commune. Paul,
in the early part of Acts, yeah.
Yeah, Paul and Peter didn't say, no, you can't do that. You need to donate the money to the mother organization and do this. So a big difference in how things were done back in Russell, Grew, and all that time and today.
Yeah, Peter was even in that little commune. Of course, it didn't work, but it was a good social experiment, I guess. It was an interesting social experiment. George Storrs, as I said, changed his views on whether or not the wicked would be resurrected, and he started incorporating those ideas into his sermons and into his paper, The Herald of Life. By the end of 1871, Storrs was in trouble. As a member of the Life and Advent Union, that splinter of the Advent Christian Church, that discussion we had with Pastor Dean, Storrs was beginning to teach doctrines they were not comfortable with.